This video is going to be about creating complementary mechanics. What we're going to go through is multiplayer games. You can look at multiplayer games to find a bunch of complementary mechanics. We're going to look at complementary patterns, and we're going to look at making a giant system and then dividing it. The idea for this video came from a comment that I got on one of the videos where I walk through the design of a bunch of puzzles in Limbo. The comment is from Gilbert Nordhammer and it reads as follows. If you don't mind, I have a game design problem I thought you could help me out with. I'm trying to make a Limbo-inspired 2D puzzle platformer where you play as two characters at once, a girl and a forest spirit, in the shape of a horse that have complementary abilities that you have to use to progress forward. I've been trying really hard to come up with what their complementary abilities should be, but right now my mind is facing a wall. Do you have any tips on how I should think in order to solve this problem? Well, Gilbert, I had a few different ideas and that's why I'm making this video. A bunch of different stuff popped into my head all at once, and I've had a few days to think about this, and this is sort of where I've come up to. Here's sort of how I personally would start approaching this problem. Well, if we want to make complementary mechanics, let's find some games with complementary mechanics. Beyond Two Souls. Beyond Two Souls is a game where you play as Jody and Aiden. Jody is your standard old typical human being, but she has a brother who is Aiden, who is this ethereal spirit that doesn't really have a body that can move things around by essentially using the force and pushing things. Now, Jody obviously has a physical form, so she can talk to people and interact with people, and she's the main character, so we follow mostly her. But the player can also swap over and play as Aiden. And as Aiden, you can move around, so you can fly, you can, because you have no body, you can move around the level in different ways, including going through doors or moving through walls, things like that Jody isn't able to do, but Aiden can. And so you get these complementary mechanics playing off each other. For example, in this first level where Aiden needs to fly around and essentially get information that he can feed back to Jody. Another game that has a bunch of complementary mechanics is Trine 2. Trine 2 has 3 different players that the player can pop back and forth between. They have the fighter, which can essentially do most of the combat but has a shield that can reflect things. They have the huntress. She is able to use ranged combat and also has this grappling hook that she can use to swing. And it has the wizard, and the wizard is able to move things and create objects using his magic powers. And so there is a bunch of different puzzles within the game that all have these different things. For example, you might have to create a cube that the huntress can then jump on and then use her grappling hook to jump further and then swing from in order to progress in the level. And you can swap back and forth between these players at any time. Another place that you find complementary mechanics a lot is in multiplayer games. So if we think about a multiplayer game as a series of systems that all interact with each other, but they're segmented into each of the classes, you can think about something like World of Warcraft, where you can't really play that game as one person. You can do it, and I haven't played it for a long time, but it used to be a situation where you would need a party to do any of the really difficult content. You would need someone that would heal, then that would complement the tank. The tank would go in and get a lot of aggro and make sure that the other players didn't get hit, and the healer would heal the tank and all the rest of the party. While the tank was keeping the attention of the other mobs, all of the people that were much weaker in terms of the amount of health that they have, but could deal much more damage, were able to do their DPS. And so as a system of mechanics, you can think of about that as one series or one set of combat mechanics that are sliced into different classes that complement each other. Another example of a game that has some very strong complementary mechanics is Evolve. Evolve is a game that came out as a premium and then went free to play a few years back. Essentially, it's an asymmetric multiplayer game where a bunch of hunters hunt a singular monster. One player plays as the monster and several players play as the hunters. When the game first released, within the hunters there was a series of skills that were divided between each of the different classes. In particular, you had the trapper, and the trapper was able to throw down essentially the net, which was an ability which restricted the area that the monster could run away in. And so some of the hunters had a situation where they would do lots of damage to the monster and they would need to herd it towards the trapper, and then the trapper would need to throw down the trap, and then the hunters could really do some damage to it. And you can think of other multiplayer games as well, like the complements between different compositions of an Overwatch team, or you can think about the different compositions of a Team Fortress team. Multiplayer is a really, really good place to look for these complementary mechanics because there are lots of places where the developer has had this idea of a system and then split it up into various vertical slices that they have allocated to classes, which allows different characters to have to interact in order to be able to complete their goals. There's a bunch of these different team-based multiplayer games that are similar to that have been coming out recently. And that idea of slicing is really where my head went very, very quickly. It was this idea that if I had to make my own complementary mechanics, I would be looking at patterns that had two sides to it within game design, or even within things like traversal and stuff like that. You want something that has two sides to it. A really typical example might be someone that is small. So they're really short and they have another person that you're playing with, or that as a character that goes along with them that's really tall. So the small person can get into small areas and the tall person can maybe climb up on ledges that the small person can't reach. And so there's this dynamic of like, you might have the small person crawl into a vent, and then that flicks a switch which opens a door which lets the tall person come in, and then the tall person might be able to reach up and grab a lever which opens the next door, and so they can both progress by each of them using their abilities to their benefit. And you can skin that however you want. You could have a fairy and an ogre, or you could have a giant sci-fi robot and a small child or something like that. You can skin that however you like. And we can look at other patterns within game design as well. So something like generators and sinks. A generator is something that creates resources for the player, and a sink is somewhere where the player will spend those resources. Now, in terms of complementary mechanics, you would need to work out how you were going to put that inside of something like two different players. But a good example of this being used in a game, although it might not have been designed like this, is actually Yoshi's Island. So Yoshi's Island has a bunch of things that you can eat and they become eggs. So they're generating a resource for you, which is your eggs, but they also are sinks. So in certain situations, you may be able to use the enemies in order to generate eggs, and in other situations, you may need to use eggs in order to sink your resources but be able to continue. And it goes back and forth like this. So enemies are both a resource and a sink for your resources. And that's for one particular player, but you could strip that apart and give one to one character and one to the other character. So I can imagine something like that might be, maybe you have a robot that eats resources and creates ammunition, and then you have another character that uses that ammunition up in their weapon that the robot doesn't have. The robot doesn't have a gun, but the other character does. And so you've got a generator and a sink where the one of the players that you might need to play as can generate stuff and the other person can use it, and there's a balance between how much stuff is getting generated and how much stuff is being used. Another similar pattern that you could quite easily do is risk and reward. Risk and reward is an interesting one because you can have something that's really high risk and really high reward, or really low risk and really low reward, and then you slice that down the middle and you give something that may be like really high risk but really high reward to one player, and one thing that's really low risk and low reward to the other character. And so you create this dynamic of maybe sometimes you need to do the high risk thing, or maybe sometimes you need to do the low risk thing. That's kind of, you could play that into damage as well. Something's high damage, something's low damage. An example that I really like is from a game called Natural Doctrine. Natural Doctrine is this really strategic tactics game out of Japan. And long story short, you essentially have areas on the field where different characters can move. And one of the characters that you get is Mel. Mel has a golem. She's able to control golems. She herself is very, very, very weak, but her golem is very, very, very strong. She is a sniper and the golem is a melee combatant. But there's a risk reward here because Mel can only control her golem if she's within 2 squares of it. So you can't move this really, really strong golem too far away from this really, really weak character, which means you need to balance how close or how far away that pair is to the enemy. If the enemy's really close, they can quickly move around the golem and kill Mel, which means that you lose the character. And the golem will stop working as well because it's no longer being controlled. But if you don't move close at all, well, the golem isn't being used and he's one of your strongest, highest damaging units. So it's kind of this balance between the complementary mechanics of a close-up, really high damaging unit and a far away long range sniper unit, but the two are tied together to give it this kind of complementary dynamic. Really interesting, really interesting. The last way that I was thinking that you could probably go about doing things is you could essentially do a list, or if you wanted to, you could just write them all down on a piece of paper, but look at what you want out of the entire system. So you might say you're going to have switches and you're going to have jumps and you're going to have ledges that are too tall and you're going to have vents that you can crawl through or whatever. Work out what the mechanics are that you want to have and then draw a line between the two of them so that there's two sets and give one set to one character and one set to the other character. You can tweak that and push things back and forth, and there's going to be a distinct kind of overlap there because usually in these sorts of situations there's a general set of traversal mechanics that are shared between the two, but then you can kind of tweak and push and pull and blah, blah, blah. So if you think about it from a systems perspective, a giant whole perspective, and then you're making a cut down the middle and giving one set of abilities to one person and one set of abilities to the other person. That, I imagine, would at least help you get something that you can start on, and then you'll be able to feel your way through the process a little bit. Another way to visualize this is to find complementary mechanics in the sense of two mechanics that work together. The way that you could find a bunch of really good ways that mechanics that have two purposes that work together, very similar to Downwell, is by going to the GMTK 2017 Game Jam page and going through some of the submissions on that page. The GMTK, or Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam, was the first game jam that Mark Brown ran for his Game Maker's Toolkit channel. And the Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam's theme for that year was a mechanic that has two purposes. It has a dual purpose design. And so a bunch of people submitted a bunch of games into that game jam, and that is a really good place to look for these kinds of mechanics that have two purposes that complement each other. Now, that's not quite what you're talking about, but you can take something like that where, for example, there was one game where you can shoot an arrow into the wall and then you can jump on that arrow in order to, it basically becomes a platform as well as a damaging thing. You can give the ability to land on one of those platforms to one player and the ability to shoot the arrows to the other player. And so these dual purpose designs become very powerful in terms of your problem because you can look at them as mechanics that you can split up and give to different players. And it also is just a different, fresh way of thinking about this problem. Okay, that's my thoughts on creating complementary mechanics. Hopefully that's enough to just get the juices flowing and get you out of the rut that you're in. Thanks for the question, Gilbert, and for everybody else, I'll see you in the next one.